Could I get your name and job title, please?
Yeah, hi, I'm Arun or Arunabha Sengupta to give my full name, and I'm a cricket writer. My latest book being Elephant in the Stadium.
Let's start with your latest book, Elephant in the Stadium. What sort of inspired this? Because it's a story that's been told a little bit, but I would say that from my perspective as a historian, when I go back, there's maybe not as much information out there as I would like there to be on what is such an important moment in, well, now in international cricket rather than just Indian cricket.
Mhm. So there were several factors here that growing up, we never heard the end of this particular triumph in at the Oval because it was the pioneering triumph, and also whenever we had later victories, and I'm talking about the 80s when India beat England 2-0 in England, and that was a much more clinical
Mm.
victory when you go back to the scorecards. We were always told that that particular victory in 71, that was the like epitome. You couldn't better that. And that was when Indians defeated England in England and West Indies in West Indies and all that. So there was always the fascination for that series, and I wanted to dig deeper into it. Um, as well as something else played into my motivation. That is, as you can understand, you and I, we look at facts and figures, and that always varies a lot from the fables
Mm.
that we hear. So, something that we kept on hearing is that our spinners at that time were the best spinners who won the test matches on seaming tracks, turned them square on seaming tracks. And when I looked at the match records and the reports of contemporary reports of that time, that's not quite the case. India were outplayed in this on the seaming wickets of Manchester, and also they got really turning tracks at the Oval and also at Lords. So if we look at the contemporary records of those days, we find that, and that was also something that I wanted to bring into light, like write history
Mm.
properly if you have to write it. And thirdly, there was also the social implication. That is, India was just 24 years into independence and what it meant to people. Why do we have such a lot of mythology crafted around that particular win? We have to understand a lot of things for that. For example, when India went in 1967, they were paid a princely allowance of £1 per day, the cricketers. So a lot of them could not afford to buy pullovers or jumpers to go into the field, and they had to cut down on their meals to afford the sweaters. And they were on the back foot even before the England bowlers ran to bowl to them. So, and India was not taken very seriously on the global platform from the political point of view, from the entertainment point of view. Nowhere they were taken seriously. Uh, After independence, they had played 19 test matches in England. 19 test matches in England after independence. They had lost 18. And they would have lost the other one as well unless it had rained. So when they went in 1971 on the first day of the tour, that is the first match they played against Middlesex at Lords, there was not one single article in the papers that told people that they are actually, this is a touring side about to play a test match or about to play a tour
Mm.
match. There was only one line announcement that cricket today, India versus Middlesex from 11:30 or something like that. And nothing else was reported. So they were not taken seriously at all. The previous tours, they were taken a bit seriously because it was Mansur Ali Khan Pataudi or the Nawab of Pataudi who was leading India, and that princely connections that had some sort of fascination for the English
Mm.
public, also the English press. But I'm not even talking about Ashes, like 1968 when Australia toured England. Gubby Allen was writing features, and Arlott was writing features. So it was like a completely different story. But even that summer, 1971, Pakistan had traveled before India, and even their visit was much more better covered because they had at least won something in England before that. And finally, the final reason is that that was a very pivotal moment in the history of India and Pakistan and the birth of Bangladesh in the same year, 1971. The two countries were about to go to war, and they were sharing that summer in England, which was quite a moment. Like there is a lot of politics, there is a lot of history, social history, political history that is woven into the book. I talk about the tour in general, but also all the matches, and in between how the Indo-British relationship through the ages up to independence, after independence up to 1971, and what happened after that when the power dynamics shifted totally with the current generation, with IPL and so on. So everything goes into the book.
And it's an interesting series because it's not like India is dominating or anything in that particular series. As you said, the one in in the 80s is up. I think you used the word clinical. Like that was just a normal test win, right? This one has a bit more. I don't know if you heard the series that me and Abhishek did on the teams who first beat England. Teams when they first beat England. There's a bit more of. There was always two stories. Some were just right place, right time. This one felt a little bit right place, right time. The interesting thing, of course, there is you talk about the pitches. We know that on occasion you can get pitches that help in spinning conditions in England. Certainly a lot more back then because you're looking at that era where there were still a lot of very good English spinners coming through and everything else. But it doesn't really matter how you beat England for that first time in England. It kind of matters that you beat England. And it comes, there are other things that you haven't talked about there, like when the Indian batters, who were very well respected in India and very well respected when playing in Asian conditions, would come to England and they would see fast bowling, that suddenly they would be written off as a joke. You would have the odd player who was very well respected because obviously even players who were born in India had played for England at that point. So it wasn't that no one thought Indians couldn't play. But the collective of Indian cricket wasn't really thought to be up to the rigors of Test match cricket, right? So it's an important thing from the way it changes the narrative on Indian cricket within England. It also changes the narrative a little bit back home when it comes to India. And it's the step towards what happens in 1983, which is the step towards what's happened, what Indian cricket is today, right? All those big moments on the way there are the reason that Indian cricket is in the position it's in today.
Yeah, I mean, these all played their roles, and this was a pivotal moment because that was the first time that India was taken seriously on the world stage, I could say. And yeah, a lot of other circumstantial things happened during the 90s, like the South African tour, which led to the satellite TV going out in a big way, and the population of India playing a huge role in that. That cricket was beamed into all the smaller towns, villages, and that played a huge role. But all started with this 1971 tour when people didn't expect India to win. People didn't expect India to do well at all. Even when they had beaten West Indies in West Indies just before the tour, when they traveled to England, there was a kind of a ceremony that was hosted by Sports Week, and in that, different former cricketers were asked for their predictions, how India would do in England. And even they didn't give India much of a chance. The best they got was 50-50, but most of them were 80-20 in favor of England, 60-40 in favor of England, even though India had just beaten West Indies. And England were holding the Ashes. They had just won the Ashes in 70-71, Illingworth's team. So they were considered quite unbeatable, especially in England, where India had never won anything. And as you said, 86, it was definitely much more clinical. It was a 2-0 victory, and India dominated the entire series. 71, the first test at Lord's could have gone either way. It was a small target, and because of the rains, India chased quickly and lost a lot of wickets. And in the end, they were 8 down with some runs to get. And one of the remaining batsmen was Chandrasekhar, who was not really that good with the bat.
That's an understatement, but yes.
Yeah. And then the second test at Manchester, they were outplayed. They were totally outplayed, and they would have lost heavily. Only there was rain on the last day, and so it was drawn. Final test, England had the upper hand till about midday on the fourth day, and they had a big first innings lead when Chandrasekhar, who did not have that good a series till that time, he turned the tables with a spell that has gone down as one of the best spells of the 20th century, 6 for 36. And that really turned the tables, and there was a battle of attrition on the final day, and India's made heavy weather of the small target, but they still got home by 4 wickets. So it was not really that convincing a win, but when they came back, they had beaten England, they had beaten West Indies, and so with time, this became one of the victories that was written in the stars. They were impregnable team, they were invincibles, and so on, which is understandable. Given the condition of India at that time, given the way they were just an emerging nation, and also they were going to war. Nothing really raises the jingoism than a war in the country. So all this, and the government also, Indira Gandhi's government also capitalized on this victory to for it to act as an unifying force.
It's not like politicians to take someone else's sporting triumph and use it for their own myth. It's never happened before, and it'll never happen again. It's interesting because there's obviously the West Indies series as well, and this kind of leads me into what I want to talk about a little bit. One of the series I'd love to watch and know a lot more about is when West Indies played Pakistan, and there were 2 triple hundreds, and the world record, probably the longest innings we'll ever have in Test cricket, and then one of the early great innings that we will have in Test cricket, and the world record at that time. There's almost nothing about that series. It was very poorly covered from both sides. As you know, West Indies cricket, the journalists didn't often travel, so they would see the game in their own place, but they wouldn't really see the game anywhere else. In those days, in the early days of Pakistan cricket, that was before the PCB even sent people on the road to be able to do that. And at least in the other era, they would pay the journalists to travel. That wasn't really the case then. Mm-hmm. There's a little bit. There's quite a bit. Although, as you said, it was ignored at times. The India-England series, the India-West Indies series, from a historian point of view, how much is there to really delve through and take a look at? I would assume there wouldn't be much video footage, if any cinematic footage of that at all. You would probably get newspapers at each individual location that might have covered it, but it would have been a lot of wire pieces that were probably repeated over and over again. There wouldn't be that much about the India-West Indies tour unless there is stuff written in the books of the players who were playing.
Yeah. Before I answer about the 1971 India-West Indies series, let me go back to a contrast, which will tell you about the contrast in cricket reportage. 1952-53, India went to West Indies for the first time. And it was the meeting of people, because there were a lot of indentured laborers who had gone to West Indies from India right in the 1860s, and they were seeing their own people coming and playing there for the first time. So there was a huge amount of excitement. There was a lot of Indian players who were extremely popular. It was a 5-test series. They played brilliantly, and it was a 1-0 win for the West Indians. And that series has nothing written about it. There's absolutely nothing written about it. 6 months later, or less than that, a few months later, Australia, Lindsay Hassett's Australia, came to England to play the 1953 Ashes. And that was the coronation Ashes, because the previous coronation took place in 1953. And because of the coronation, there was a huge amount of excitement. Everything that was going on was like bloated out of proportion. It was a 5-test series, 1-0 victory in favor of England. The same result, the same scoreline. And there are 11 books written about that Ashes series.
There are 11 books written about it so far. While we're doing this podcast, 2 more may be written.
Yes, of course. There is always that possibility, especially given the age of the people who write cricket books nowadays. So 11 books already written and more on the way, probably. And that was also a 5-test series which ended 1-0. And because of all the hype, it has gone down as an excellent series, very, very exciting series. It was not that. If you look at the scorecards, people, I don't think they really enjoyed seeing Trevor Bailey block every ball, appeal for the light at midday under the midday sun to so that the last over before lunch was not bowled, and then bowl down the leg side to ensure a draw. So it was not really a great series, but it has gone down as a great series because that's how the narrative is changed. So you see the skew in reporting. So similarly, 1971 also, when India went to West Indies, there are a lot of stories that we hear, but this is again narrative based or anecdotal stories. Anecdotal stories that Salim Durrani, he gave the idea to Wadekar that um, who was it who gave the idea to Wadekar to bring Durrani on, and he dismissed Sobers and Lloyd in quick succession in the victory test, the test that India won there. And what happens when there is not a proper like proper reference books or reference articles, then the conception of history is a bit skewed. So we know that in 1970s, West Indies developed a great bowling attack. So all the fast bowlers came one after the other. In the 1960s, they had Hall and Griffith, and to some extent Gilchrist. And in the 1970s, Roberts, Holding, Garner, Marshall, all of them evolved this craft and so on. So when people say Gavaskar scored 774 runs in his first series, a lot of them mix it up with the great pace bowling attack that he faced and scored all those runs. Actually, it was a very weak attack. Like West Indies, from 1966 onwards, they had never won a series at home, and till 1973. So they were going through a barren patch.
Yeah, their best players had kind of aged. Their best batters had aged out. They had they had the off spinner. Why have I forgotten his name? Lance Gibbs.
But he also was out of form, and actually Noriga played for West Indies in the series.
So
two
they
test
and Griffiths didn't play.
No, Hall and Griffith.
Yeah, so Hall and Griffith. I'm just trying to remember if they both retired. And those sorts of narratives, I find really, really interesting. And I think sometimes in cricket writing, because it was more poetic than boxing writing and horse racing writing and the other early forms of writing, there was a feeling that you could get away with a little bit more. So Cardis is a perfect example of someone that was, I think it was the Aubrey Faulkner game that he suddenly had all these details on, and probably wasn't there, right? When Aubrey Faulkner made the runs against the Australians in that late game when he was 39 or 42 or whatever, however old he was. And there's a lot of stories about that. And even if you go back, I was thinking about this today, and you'll remember the name. I've forgotten the name of it. The first book that was that was kind of a cricket history book was written about Hambledon by someone.
John
Nyren. You read that,
and he was also there was a lot of plagiarism.
Well, that was the other thing. I mean, even Wisden started with that. But you read the John Nyren book, and it does read a little bit like, and this is an Australian cricket culture thing, so I'm not sure if this translates to every cricket culture in the world. But like at the end of the year, you have an award ceremony in major Australian cricket clubs, and like people will give stories about the year, and suddenly everything will be this guy was bowling the smoke, and somehow little nugget, he got up and he scored all these runs, and all the stories are blown out, but everyone knows that, right? Because everyone's in the room and they understand that the captain's just having a little bit of fun, and the season went this way. But you read John Nyren's book and you're like, well, that's retold as gospel over and over again. And one of the most famous ones, of course, is the birth of overarm bowling by the family whose son writes about his mother inventing overarm bowling, despite the fact that no one was wearing those dresses at the time that he claims in his story and everything else. So there's a big part of cricket literature which you and I are reading, and we have to decipher whether the writer was having a little bit of fun with it. Like, this is something you'll know. I think you know exactly what I mean. How often you read about someone having a smirk on their face when they were batting, and then you go to one of the oval or somewhere, and you're like, well, you're 120 meters away from that person. And it was before binoculars. You probably didn't have binoculars, because they would have been big, goofy things back in those days. How did you see the smirk? I can barely see the player.
The Carter said that that was higher truth. That was what he was supposed to like. That was his character. He was writing about his character. That was what he would should have done, whether he did it or not. And Carter's actually gave the license to the later generation journalists to like blow up their reports by saying that the scoreboard is an ass. And I do have a particular boxed item in the Elephant in the Stadium, which is called "Keeping Up with the Kardashian." you know, because there also he had done several mistakes in the 1950s with India and Pakistan tours. So when he had written about them, but cricket always has put narrative over facts and figures,
Yep.
narrative history, anecdotal history over facts and figures, and that it is my hypothesis that ties right into the history as it is written by the um, Anglo-centric history, Anglo-centric history, wherever it is written. Because Carter's famous words that scoreboard is an ass, why does it resonate so much? Because if you look at a scoreboard, you will find that in history, in the Boer War, there were 27,000 women and children who died because of the British concentration camps. You'll find so many famines in the history of the empire. You'll find 33 million Bengalis died in the Bengal famine. It's much better to write that there were great institutions which were like erected by the British who wherever they went, and Churchill won the war with two fingers, victory. So the narrative always takes precedence. It's much easier than to look at the facts and figures and find out what exactly happened. And cricket was kind of with civilization, Christianity. Cricket was one of the pillars of evangelization. This empire evangelization, and that same concept of fabricating a sort of glorified image of history that actually is there, especially if you take the interwar period. That was one time when it was not very certain that the empire would survive or not, and cricket was one of the pillars. And there, a lot of the writings of Warner or Cardus, they actually glorified cricket beyond like recognizable shape, with all the spirit of cricket coming into being, coming into the picture with in a big way, and all that nonsense that goes along with it. So, so we all know that whatever the older writers wrote, like they heard get them in singles, we'll get them in singles, was saying to Rhodes, that never happened. Yeah, and when David Frith actually interviewed Rhodes later on in his life, and Rhodes was old, and he said that we didn't use the word singles at that time, and who knows, we might have got a two. That was his answer. So definitely that didn't happen. But these stories are always there. These stories are always there. So, and that actually dogs cricket even today, because it is a very elitist culture that whether you belong to certain clubs or not, and that's the way the history is written. So we always go by primary source, which essentially means have you talked to these 90-year-olds who had actually been in that match? So they might not have anything new to say, but if you interview them and if you write down whatever they tell you, that may be totally different from what actually happened, because they have forgotten or they have been giving after dinner talks for so many years and their version has totally changed. But that still plays a role.
For example, I mean, one of my favorite stories of all time in cricket is the David Boone drinking story. And why I love it so much is it's so illogical, right? And it comes, the whole story is about David Boone having to drink this many beers to break a record. But that record was only made that number because someone else had made another number. And then they changed that number, and then that number went up. So the original story was just drank a lot of beers. Then it became drank an exact amount of beers so that you could beat it. Then they changed that around, and then David Boone beats that record. And I remember talking to, Jeff Lawson and Dean Jones were not particularly happy when I made fun of it. But no one who's drinking that heavily can count how many beers they've had. And no flight attendants in the world are sitting there counting out how many individual beers went to one particular person. And whether he finished them or not, or dropped a bunch or anything else, on top of the fact he would have been in the toilet the entire trip, right? But it becomes part of the
Yeah,
narrative of Australian cricket, that romanticizing and everything else. And once you do it with that, that's when you start to get to the point where you're just like, well, why would you make up something so small and push that? What else is going on? And I do think that, you talk about the Gavaskar making the runs against, the weaker attack. And we see all these sorts of narratives within cricket that fit national identity or fit the empire or fit, the English culture, the English history of the game. And sometimes it's like, it takes the smallest little chip to be able to take it out of it, and you suddenly realize, you would know this more than anyone else, but the amateur side of things, right? When we did Death of a Gentleman, we went right around England doing screenings of the show and then doing Q&As. At the Q&A, at every single Q&A, we were asked, don't you think that if cricket went back to the amateur days, a lot of these problems would go away? Right? They had no idea what they meant by amateur cricket, right? They had no idea what they were even saying, but they had read the glory of the amateur game, and they thought it was something beautiful, not knowing that, as you and I know, a lot of the amateurs made more money than the professionals anyway, and it was a terrible system.
Terrible system. There was a huge amount of difference between the classes. There was amateurism. They claimed more expenses than actually what the professionals made together. Each of the amateurs made that amount of money. So when WG's team was going to Australia in 1891-92, there were a group of professionals standing there, and in their accounts we find out that WG had a wine allowance, and they said that he would drink enough to sink the ship. So these are ridiculous. And because of this amateur tradition, the not only in cricket we see England playing with virtually 10.5 men for a long time in their history, because a professional had to be the captain, could not be the captain. So
you had to come from the right kind of family to lead the team.
Yes, to come from the right kind of family. And also Hammond actually turned an amateur from being a professional so that he could become the captain. And even when Hutton became the captain, and very successful captain, who went to and won the Ashes, he was picked on so much by Swanton. Every move was criticized, and so this sort of things are there. Such a lot of rather ordinary cricketers have played the game because they were amateurs. Percy Chapman captaining the side when Hobbs, Sutcliffe, Hutton all are in the team. It's ridiculous. But this happened, and Australia benefited because they never had that system, because they were all like money-making ventures, for which they traveled, and that was quite clearly known.
Yeah. I mean, they were the first team, the first Test team to go on strike, right? Australia, a good number of their players don't go on the Tri Series, the ICC series. Because they weren't getting paid. I wanted to talk to you about something else that was slightly different. It's related to the book a little bit as well. If Australian cricket isn't covered as well as English cricket, but if I can find a newspaper archive or go into a library or something, I can quite often find a fair bit of information about what I want, even if it's just one article, right? Mm-hmm. India is so different because there's so many different different languages. Right. When you're an Indian historian, how hard is it to, I'm assuming the great majority of the writing was done in English and Hindi at times, but there would have been really good interviews with players that would have been done in other languages that you don't have access to, or that weren't transcribed as faithfully as you would have wanted, or, anything like that. It's a whole different ball game. I would have thought that it's hard enough for you to find, not everything from India is being digitized the same way that, say, Australian newspapers have all been digitized. And then you've got the language barrier. Is that a constant problem that you have when trying to tell India's cricket history?
Yes, that's a constant problem. And I will tell you, I was just chatting with Mihir Bose recently. And when he wrote the history of Indian cricket, that was the first definitive history that Indian cricket had, because previously it had not been written that way. And he said that he often found more information sitting in England rather than going and looking in the archives in India. about Indian cricket. He found more in England than in India. So it is difficult to find information about Indian cricket in India. And some of, for example, this there was a tour book that was written in 1971, um, and that is a decent tour book, but very small and just some brief description of each of the matches. It was useful to me, but then when I look at the reports made by, say, John Arlott or reports made by some other journalists sitting in England and the reports made by the person who wrote the tour book, 1971 tour book, there are a lot of discrepancies which tend to happen. And there are vernacular newspapers as well, which did their own reporting. So I know Hindi, I know Bengali, I can look at them if I get the sources. So some Bengali newspapers I do have access to, I can look up the sources. But then when it is a normal match report, this is a very frank admission, when it's a normal match report, I can see what happened, what was the score at a particular juncture. Those are quite accurate most often. But when it becomes a local hero, a
Yeah.
regional hero, then the entire narrative changes, and it is very difficult to really take that on face value. It's and it is even now it is the case. Like you take any player from the south and you look at the southern newspapers, you take a player from the east and look at the eastern newspapers, there will be a bias, and which is quite understandable, but it is a bit frustrating for the
Mm.
historian. And what I'll add one particular point now. It might not have come up otherwise. When you look at the Indian history of Indian cricket or Pakistani cricket or Sri Lankan cricket, you see something that is, I find it quite surprising, or not surprising, but not really desirable, is that a lot of history of the subcontinent is written by Anglo-Australian
Yep.
writers. Even today, a lot of history is written by the Anglo-Australian writers who not only face this challenge of not having access to the stuff, but they also don't know the
Mm.
languages. But that is the case. It is accepted that Anglo-Australian writers do write the history. Indian writers write about Indian cricket, Sri Lankan writers about Sri Lankan cricket, Pakistanis about Pakistani cricket, but you don't find the thing happening the other way. Pakistani writers writing about England or Indian writers writing
I
about
would say
Australia.
this is the first
I,
generation where you have Bharat and Usman, where you actually have that sort of starting, right? Like before that, there was individuals who might have crossed over, but they were probably still seen as experts in their local area. So Bharat being the Australian writer for Crick Buzz is quite a big deal. And obviously Usman being based in the UK and not really writing much about Pakistani cricket anymore, although he doesn't write that much at all. That's a big movement coming through. And I remember when I broke through,
yeah,
I was probably the first person that wrote about global cricket, and I remember a lot of Asian cricket writers being not upset, but a little bit like, "Oh, of course, it would. The first global writer would be an Australian," and it's true. It made it easier for me. I mean, in my case, I was an Australian in England, so I already had that kind of double-edged advantage. Being able to see that both countries. I suppose David Frith is probably another good example of that. Maybe in Gideon Haigh as well. When you can see both sides, everyone looks a bit ridiculous to you, so you find the middle ground a little bit easier. But I do think that this is the first generation when we will actually see more writers of the other backgrounds come through. But the other thing that you mentioned is a lot of it is to do with the media and how it's made, right? So I don't know how you feel about this, but England has what, 7 or 8 national newspapers that are all pretty big, right? And they're rich enough that they could send cricket writers all around the world. Sometimes 10 cricket writers for one series and all that sort of stuff. Australia generally had a lot of newspapers, but probably only a handful of writers who would then write for all those newspapers in one go. We talked about Pakistan before, not being the Pakistan media wasn't strong enough to be able to send journalists overseas. A lot of it is to do with your media market as well, isn't it? Like that ability, and so there is I think there's a fascination with some of these topics from people, probably, as you said, the Anglo-Australian side of things. They actually want to know more about, I had this conversation today, that's how I know this. They want to know more about Sri Lankan cricket, right? But Sri Lankan book publishing doesn't have a lot of great books on Sri Lankan cricket that you can choose from, because Sri Lankan book publishing hasn't been particularly, it isn't like English book publishing, whereas, as you know, they'll publish anything at all times.
Mm-hmm.
Like, a lot of it is market driven as well. Like, it's a really weird subsection.
Mm. The other point is that if you take a, say, Pakistani or Sri Lankan or Indian writer writing about Australia, they won't struggle with the language ever, because they all speak the
That's
language.
true.
Yeah, but it's not the same the other way around. But books are written in the other direction, and that has a lot to do with how history has been written always. So that maybe it will be like the fields will be leveled in this generation, as you say. And yes, it has a lot to do with the book publishing as well. In England, say, every week we find new books being published about some minor county cricketer who played 2 matches in 1931-32, and a retrospective about him, with primary source interviews with the fourth cousin of the second granddaughter,
There are
or something like
seven
that.
books have been written about Yorkshire cricket while you finish that sentence.
Yes.
Yeah. So no, you're right. I do think that plays a big part, and the language thing is, I think that's really, really fascinating. But I also just think in general that with the internet, there is a democratization of who can write. So, I might have been one of the first people through the door of that particular system, but behind me, there will be a bunch of people from, Muhammad Isam might end up being one of the biggest cricket writers in the world, and he's from a cricket nation that is not as respected as much as his writing is, right? Fidel Fernando is another perfect example of that as well. So there is actually this movement coming through. Even having said that, though, I was thinking about this today, that as you've said, was it 1952 series or 1951 series where it wasn't covered at all? The West Indies series.
Yeah.
Indian cricket's never going to have that problem again, because everything is covered. But now the books on this modern era will include the girlfriend's Instagram accounts, right? Like, it'll be that detailed. But I still don't think that cricket as a general concept outside of, some of the bigger markets is particularly covered well at this point. I still think there's a lot of things that are left on the table. There's a lot of reporting, but maybe not as much, deep diving and, deeper stuff that you need for those kinds of, for that kind of history. Does that make sense? Like, in 30 years time, you're probably going to know a lot more about Ian Bell than you are Shakib Al Hasan, right? And Ian Bell was a fine cricketer. We both would never argue against that. Shakib Al Hasan is an incredibly important cricketer, not just for Bangladesh, but also as an all-rounder. The impact that he had and everything else. There still feels like, to me, even though it's not like it was in the history of the game, there still does seem to be really huge missing chunks of coverage of some of these teams. And I don't know how that ever gets overcome unless there's just so many people willing to write online that people get bored with writing about India or Pakistan or Australia or England, and that those writers filter out more and more to become to become associate hipsters or small team hipsters or whatever that may be. But the stories are still out there, and I still feel that there's not as much being covered on them as there should be.
Yeah, absolutely. And historically also it has been the case, like if you take say someone like Bob Wyatt, uh, quite a minor minor in the sense he captained England, but he was not that great a cricketer. He has, I think, 3 biographies. Someone like uh, someone like Jack Crawford, who played just a few test matches as an off spinner in the first decade of the 1900s. He had 2 biographies published simultaneously. But someone like, say, a man with more than 6,800 runs in Test cricket, Dilip Vengsarkar, he doesn't have a biography yet. Vishwanath has just had a biography published, and a ghosted biography. So that sort of imbalance is there now, with India becoming such a major feature, and they're ruling cricket from the financial point of view. Of course, we all know the numbers now, 38.1%, whatever. But Indian cricketers will definitely have things written about them, good stuff or not. That's a different matter altogether. But then, as you said, Bangladeshi, or say Shakib Al Hasan or Rashid Khan, people like them, whether they will really have their lives documented in a proper way, it's a difficult question. I mean, it it again, there have been some influential British journalists or Australian journalists who have gone in and written biographies of some cricketers from minor countries. So in the past,
Yeah.
it has always been a personal drive which have made them do that. And I think Shakib's biography, or Rashid Khan, it will also have to be something like that, a personal drive, rather than something coming out of the
No,
system,
well,
because they are
I
minor.
think you're right. So I was talking to a publisher recently, and I said, I think the book that needs to be written is Owen Morgan, because it tells the story of Irish cricket, but also the rise of, New England, right? And, breaking them free of what
Yeah.
they were doing. And even Owen Morgan isn't directly responsible for baseball, but because of what Owen Morgan did, baseball was able to be used as a thing. So everywhere you look around English cricket, but you could just see the publisher go, yeah, but it's still an Irish cricketer, even though he won a World Cup for
Irish.
England, right? Now that's you compare that to Shakib or Rashid Khan, they're going to be further down. And I've had these conversations before. I've had very fine international cricketers come to me and ask to write books, and you go to the publishers or the agents, and there's that sort of look of, wow, we're not going to sell that many copies. And it's the wrong way of looking at it anyway, because realistically, if the book's good and it works, it should be very sellable. But that's obviously not how book publishers work. But it does feel to me that there is still that out there. But, then there is the other part of this is, what is the future of cricket book writing? Because I think in England, which is probably still its best market, that not only is the demographic who buys books quite old, but as you said before, the demographic who writes books is often quite old. And there's sort of this, there are a lot of books that are written that are sold to between 5 and 10,000 people, and they're seen as a success, and that writer gets another book on the back of that, right? But there are very few breakthrough cricket books. So your book has won an award. Jeff Lemon's written books that have won awards. Lots of my friends have books with awards. There aren't many books, though, that have gone from that level, or selling 5 to 10,000 copies, to actually become important. And I don't know if that's because of the flooding of the market, or because they don't know how to advertise these books. They don't know how to push these books and market these books beyond, because, your book is a perfect example of, it's about cricket, but it's about India, right? And it's about empire. And it's about, everything sort of coming together. And as you said, Bangladesh and Pakistan and even the West Indies are involved. It's a cultural book, right? And the best cricket books are cultural books, even if they are about facts and figures and the scoreboard, or not being an ass or not, right? And I feel that too often that these aren't sold as great stories, but they are sold as cricket books, which is a completely different thing. And if you're selling everything as a cricket book, well, then it has to be a book about a famous person, right? Because why else would you read it? Whereas that's not really where the better writing quite often is. Some of these great books are not really about the bigger stories. So it does. You've written a lot, a lot of books of recent time, and I sort of wonder where you think the next jump is. Do Indians then start reading more books, or is it a Kindle-led future, or is it people like me writing a book and then using it to make podcasts out of?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question to answer. Difficult in the sense it is quite painful to answer, because uh, Indian there's a huge population, and most of them like to curl up in bed with a good phone. You know, so they're used to reading tweets, And I don't blame them. That's technology, and that's the way the world is going now. Um, they will probably, like, I'm not generalizing the Indians, but most of the cricket crowd, they will generally read, not read, but they will pose with books. Maybe if it is about a
Yeah.
superstar cricketer, they'll buy it. A lot of the book launches are very important. In the launch, there are about 50 important guests, all of whom are given a free copy, and none of them read the books. So that is also something that happens. None of the free copies will be read, but there are pictures with those books. So book publishing and marketing and actually reading them, these are completely different, you know. And as you said, cricket books. Um, that has a particular connotation with it. We like to believe cricket produces the cream of sports literature, which I think is one of the myths of cricket, because by cream, yes, rich and thick, but I, I don't think it is the cream. There are lots of sports which produce much better literature. The ones who say cricket produces the best literature, they don't read any book, rather, let alone cricket. But cricket books are not taken seriously by the publishing industry. If you look at the cricket books being reviewed by national daily papers, very few will be actually reviewed. Very few are actually reviewed in the papers. If it is cricket, they don't review. If it is literature, or if it is some non-fiction which is of a more serious topic, then they review, which again is a bummer, because as you said, the best cricket books are about society, about the entire picture rather than just being about cricket. So there is a distinct gap there, and they are reviewed in the traditional cricket journals and cricket magazines. And there again, the reviewers are not the youngest people, and they have a particular templatized approach to how a cricket book should be written, and they become very um, like, they cannot quite figure out if a cricket book has been written the other in a
Yeah.
different way. So some of the examples like Crickonomics, I guess you have gone through
Yeah.
that.
I think it's
Crickonomics,
behind
the
me
book.
somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's a very good book. I mean, that's the way numbers should be used, and the actual what is happening in cricket can be interpreted through numbers. Yeah, I doubt how many people actually read it and understood it. In the traditional places where cricket books are read and reviewed. Similarly, I mean, Cricket 2.0 was another very good book. Uh, there are these sort of books need to be more in the market, which actually is a fact-based, figure-based, and does proper analysis of cricket. And there is a lot of scope of rewriting and correcting the history that has been written, that has gone down as history, which is totally erroneous. So, but again, how many people will read it? That's a that's a very good question, and it doesn't have a very good answer. Because yes, if you make a podcast about a book, maybe more people will listen to that podcast rather than actually going and reading the
That's
book.
not the case here, though, where everyone who's listened to this podcast will buy two copies, one for themselves and one for their nephew or niece, so that they have a copy of it. So you'll be okay. But no, it's a really interesting thing going forward. I'll tell you my favorite story about cricket books was when I was in Pune in 2016 or 2017 when Australia were playing India, whenever that tour was on. And I happened to be staying at a hotel where the hotel next door had a sports literature festival. And Gideon was speaking
Hmm.
there, and I think Sunil Gavaskar was speaking, and they asked me to come down, and I took their free food, as I often do, and milled around and did nothing at all, really. And then they got me a nice seat in the front row so the camera could pan to me while there was a speech on. And one of the speakers was Verinder Sehwag talking about his Twitter account. And I thought, you've got a sports literature award festival. It's all about sports writing, and you have Verinder Sehwag talking about his Twitter account, which he does not write. It does tell you a little bit about the celebrity culture of cricket books, and also why should they be taken seriously if that's what happens with them. Anyway, thank you very much. Elephant in the Stadium is available where all good books are available, and it's you'll be selling it out the back of your car if you have to. So thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here. Bye.